Encountering the texture of the text of God's Word. Text and context.
Alright. Is this the one? Here we go. Keep pushing this higher.
Welcome to Session 4 of Communication for Serving the Church. Thanks for sticking with us this long. I'm excited about this session. We've already talked about just some communication basics. We've talked about moving from the text to a message. We've talked about getting that message heard, getting it to the people on the pew. And then now we're going to talk and shift away from the more sermon-oriented and more public speaking role to a few other forms of communication in the church. In this session, Session 4, we're going to talk about teaching and small groups. Really, I'm going to talk mostly about teaching, but I think most of what we talk about with teaching really relates closely with small groups. So they go hand in hand. I'm going to keep saying teaching, but if your context is learning this information to teach a small group, then of course, just add in the information for small group instead of teaching. But I'm going to keep using the language of teaching as if it's like a Bible class at church. And then in the next session, we're going to talk about public scripture reading and prayer. Something that is very, very important. But we'll talk about that in the next video. For now, let's start talking about preaching and teaching. Preaching and teaching. What's really the difference? Is there a difference between preaching on the one hand and teaching on the other? Well, yes and no. Preaching and teaching are not really polar opposites, but they do have different emphases. They're closely related. So I would say preaching is more formal and teaching is less formal. Now let me define what I mean by formal, because certainly those who are in a more academic setting would say, well, teaching is formal. Yes, teaching is formal, but I'm thinking in the context of the local church, where teaching often is not terribly formal like it is in a proper academic setting. I'm also thinking that in general, the students and the audience, if that's what you want to call them, see, even there we distinguish between an audience versus students. With students, who are the audience of the teacher, there's more give and take with the presenter than there is in a sermon. In a sermon, it's more monological, whereas in a classroom, it's more dialogical. And really, a sermon is more streamlined. You're getting to the point. You're not going down rabbit trails, whereas teaching is a lot more open-ended. You want those rabbit trails. You want people to ask questions and say, well, that's a good question. What do you think? And then let it take us down any other which direction. So, preaching is more formal. Teaching is less formal. Preaching is more streamlined. Teaching is more open-ended. Preaching is more monological. Teaching is more dialogical. There's give and take, back and forth, and conversation. Preaching is primarily with the goal of proclamation, and teaching is primarily the goal of instruction. So the goal is different. In preaching, you are proclaiming. Let's get the word out there. Let's tell it as it is. In teaching, you're trying to tell it as it is. You're trying to proclaim, but really you're trying to instruct. You're trying to get people to get the stuff. You're trying to learn. You're trying to learn, and you're trying to get the students to learn. Everybody's trying to learn, so a different goal. Preaching is more rhetorical. Often, whenever a preacher asks a question, it's rhetorical. They're not anticipating that the people will actually respond, at least not in depth. Now, of course, there are many traditions where if the preacher says, "Are you with me?" they might say, "Yeah, preacher." Or they might have some give and take, but that give and take is still not really the same as it is in the classroom, where whenever I say, "Have you ever had one of those days?" and I'm actually asking for people to respond, "Yeah, I've had one of those days." Well, tell me about that. Okay, well, whereas in a sermon I might say, "Have you ever had one of those days?" and people go, "Oh yeah, we've all had one of those days." And then I move on. The questions are rhetorical in a sermon, whereas the questions are more actual in a classroom. So sermons more rhetorical, classrooms less rhetorical. And then also finally, preaching is in general more performative, whereas teaching is less performative. So in preaching, you might do some things that you wouldn't do in the classroom as you're trying to get the material heard because it is more performative. There's a performative aspect to preaching. And there's certainly a performative aspect to teaching, but just far less so than for preaching, if that makes sense. So those are what I would say are some pretty general distinctions between them. And again, it's general, it's broadly speaking. Of course, we could find exceptions to those rules. And remember, I'm thinking specifically of the local church context, not the formal academic context. So take that for what it's worth. So I will start with just some specifics. Just some specifics, just a few little tidbits of information that I think are important, and then we'll get a little bit more systematic in our treatment of teaching in the local church. So first, I would just recommend always come prepared with an abundance of material. Always have an abundance of material, because you would rather have more material than less material. Because this week they might be really, really talkative in class. And so you might get through precious little of your material. But if you then bank on next week being everybody talking, you might find that they're not as talkative that week. And then you don't have as much material prepared. Also, I think it's important to have an abundance of material prepared because people are always going to ask questions. And they will always ask questions about absolutely everything you can possibly imagine. We're curious creatures by nature. And so if there is some esoteric or random or related but not necessarily on topic idea, be prepared to have a little something to say about it because people will ask about it. But if you don't have anything prepared for that, also be prepared to admit that you don't know. Because I think one of the best things you can do as a teacher is to say, I don't know. What do you think? And to genuinely ask for their feedback. I don't know. What do you think? Because truth is, people respect an honest teacher who themselves is still learning. I think some people have it in their minds that teachers are supposed to have all the answers. Hello, I am the instructor. I shall open the top of your head and dump information into your cranium and then close and then and hope it works. No, teaching it's what Stephen Brookfield has said is more like whitewater rafting. I've been down this river a few times. I've led a few expeditions, but hey, there's always something new that happens. There's always something else that could happen on these whitewater rapids. I think we should think of it more in those terms for sure. So never ever be afraid to say, I don't know, what do you think? And always, perhaps this is an opportunity for you to go back and study. I don't know, let's spend the next week. I'll think about it, you think about it, let's come back and then we'll have a conversation about it. And that'll spur us on in class. Anybody else interested? You can look it up as well. And whatever you do, please do not make stuff up if you don't know. Do not make up an answer because you think you have to have an answer. If you don't know, just say, I don't know. And it's also okay to say, I don't know, but my first inclination is to think this. I probably need to think on it more, but here's kind of my initial answer. It's okay to say something like that. To just say, I ultimately don't know. This isn't something I've thought a lot about, but here's my tentative answer. Here's my for now answer. That's always a good idea. And people, I think, will always respect that honesty. I don't know, but here's my best guess for now. Stephen Brookfield is a educator. He teaches about teaching at a college level. He's written a wonderful little book called The Skillful Teacher that I'd recommend to you if you're interested. But he has a list of some things that he says it took him a while to appreciate as a teacher, some important truths that it really took him a while to appreciate. And I want to talk about a few of those because even as someone who's really only ever taught in a formal academic setting for high school students, and other than that has spent his whole life teaching in the church, I still really resonated with this, even though this is really gauged more for the formal academic and especially the college setting. So the first thing Brookfield says is, I will always feel like an imposter and will never lose the sense of amazement I feel when people treat me as if I have something valuable to offer. Wow. Yes. I will always feel like an imposter, and you might too. And this is something that some might not tell you, but let's just tell the truth here. You will always feel like an imposter because there's always more to know. And it's always amazing that someone thinks you actually have something valuable to offer to the conversation. How amazing that someone thinks I have something valuable to offer. And so that's a deep, important truth. But it's okay that you will always feel like an imposter. You will always have a sense of amazement that people actually trust you to say something and say something that matters. And that's okay. The next truth he says, I will never be able to initiate activities that keep all students engaged all the time. Having taught junior high and high school, I can tell you that is certainly the case. That you can never keep all of them engaged all of the time. And it is also the case in the local church. You cannot keep everybody engaged all of the time, especially in a setting where they're not receiving a grade. They've showed up to class because of their own willingness to show up and learn, and so they can also show up and merely check it off on a box and say, well, I attended, just as easily. Don't beat yourself up that you can't always, you'll never be able to find an activity that keeps everybody engaged all the time. It's just part of it. Also, the regular use of examples, anecdotes, and autobiographical illustrations in explaining difficult concepts is always strongly appreciated by students. It's always good to use lots of examples and anecdotes, and especially autobiographical illustrations. We've already talked about some of this with some of the other communication advice, and that is the best illustrations and examples you can find are not those that you find in a book, but those that you come up with yourself from just paying close attention and notice. So never underestimate those autobiographical illustrations, or to just give some example or anecdote, a good story that illustrates it well. Stories are always appreciated by people. Well, always assuming they actually illustrate the point that you're trying to make. Another piece of advice, he says, making full disclosure of my expectations and agendas is necessary if I am to establish an authentic presence in the classroom. Oh, for more authentic presence in a classroom. One of the best things you can do. We can learn about technique and know-how, and we can talk about all these things, but more than anything else, it's about presence and being. What is your presence in the classroom? When you're in there, what is your presence? I think of a certain high school teacher that I had who, for other teachers, they just couldn't gather our attention very well. And they had to constantly be yelling and screaming while we were in high school to get us to stop talking and stop flirting with your girlfriend and pay attention. But there was one teacher in particular who every time he walked into the classroom, we would still kind of be talking amongst ourselves, mulling. But as soon as he stepped up into the front of the classroom, behind his little lectern, and pulled out his notes, everybody went quiet and we were glued to him until the end of class. And I think it was just his presence. He was always very good about letting us know what his expectations were, what his agendas were. So he would come in and he would say, my agenda for today is to get you to really appreciate the importance of the American Revolution. I can't remember anything more specific, but let's just say the importance of the American Revolution. He was a history teacher. And that was his agenda for the day. And so at the end of class, he might say, do you have a better appreciation for it? How so? Talk to me about it. And so that was clearly his agenda. His expectations were always clear. This is what I want you to do, and this is how I want you to do it, and this is what it would look like to have it done well. Now, that's all in like more academic settings. So in the church or in small groups, what does it look like to make full disclosure of your expectations and agendas? Well, if you have a small group, just say, my agenda for tonight is that we would soak in the text. My agenda is no agenda, just that God would speak to us from the text. So let's just read it and wait until God says something to us. That works. Or your expectation. Okay, my expectation is that I'll give some explanation of the text for the first 15 minutes, and then from there we'll discuss it, and I hope that the information I give is going to provide good seed bed for discussion. All right, let's go. Even just simple things like that. Or that's a small group setting. A more realistic teaching setting in like a Bible class is to say, my expectation is to get through John chapter 5 today. We've really got to get through it. So I'm sorry, that's my agenda, to get through John chapter 5 today so that we can keep moving with this class. So we're not going to be able to discuss as much as normal. I really just need to kind of lecture this. Or to say, we're ahead of schedule. And so we're supposed to be on John chapter 3, and we're already on John chapter 5. So we're going to take our time and discuss this and really soak into the text. So feel free that if you have a question or comment, feel free to interrupt at any time. The free flow. So just making your expectations and your agendas really known, it creates a real authentic presence in the classroom. Another one of the truths that he thinks is important for teachers to know: I always have power in the classroom, and I can never be a fly on the wall withering away to the point that students don't notice I'm in the room. The teacher's the person with power, and not just in the settings where you're the teacher at a school, but even in church and small groups, the teacher is the one who has the power in the room. And so you can't just take your hands off of it and say, well, that really got away from me. No, I mean, it's on you. You were chosen, or you volunteered to be a teacher, to be a small group leader, a facilitator. And so you've got the power. You can't just sit back and watch, which is why it aggravates me to no end whenever I've been in church classes before where people will say, well, this is a discussion class, so if y'all don't discuss, then it's just going to be a bad class. What I hear whenever they say that is, look, I didn't put in the time and responsibility to actually prepare enough material and to become present enough in the classroom and to become confident enough in my ability to lead and facilitate the conversation, that I'm hoping that y'all just blabber on so that I can check this off and say that I taught. That might sound harsh, but I'm telling you, the teacher has the power. They're the ones in charge. If you're in charge, be in charge. If you've got the power as the teacher, use that power to help us learn and to grow and to think. Another one, modeling critical thinking is crucial to helping students learn it, but many are going to resist it anyway. Even in the church setting, critical thinking is important. Don't ever dismiss somebody else's viewpoint just out of hand. Be critical. Well, here's what I think. But you raise a good point, and I hadn't thought of it like that. Now, have you considered you're being critical? And also, especially in the classroom, it's a little different in a sermon, perhaps, where you don't really have as much time to go back and forth and to view something from every angle. But especially in the classroom, always be ready to say, well, there's different sides to this debate. Some people think this, and here's why they think it. Some people think this, and here's why they think it. I personally am in this camp. Now, a lot of what people will say is, and so what you're doing is you're helping see that there's multiple sides and the debate continues. Help people understand what the debate is, what the pieces of the puzzle are that make this thing a little complicated. And sometimes you have to help people see why it's complicated, because otherwise they're just like, well, it seems simple to me. Yes, because scripture and its interpretation are so simple. It's only like we've been debating some of these things for 2,000 years, right? So help them see some of that texture in the text. Help them see, no, there's a debate about what that means. There's a debate about how we should understand that. And help them appreciate what that is. Even if you don't think the opposite side, help them see why someone might. Because someone in your classroom might think that. And it's always healthy just to help us think. Resistance to learning is a highly predictable presence in the classroom, and its presence in your classroom does not mean you are a failure. It's true in Sunday school, it's true in small groups, it's true in church Bible classes. People resist learning. And just because someone is resisting learning does not mean that you are a failure. You can create the environment in which learning is possible, in which learning is helpful, but you can't force someone to learn, which is the next one. You cannot motivate someone to learn at a very basic level if they don't wish to. You just can't force someone to learn if they just don't want to. You can remove whatever organizational, psychological, cultural, interpersonal, pedagogic barriers that are getting in the way of their learning. You can provide the best model you possibly can. You can provide the best possible case for why learning is important. You can provide the best environment possible. But as the old saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can provide the environment, but you can't make them learn. you pour your heart and your soul into studying for a small group, a Bible class, a children's hour. And the children's hour in Sunday school are distracted. They don't listen. They tear up their coloring sheet. They have emergencies and have to rush to the bathroom. People in small group are just there for the food. And the people in your Bible class, nobody shows up. Or 2 people show up. Or somebody shows up and they're just there because that's what they've always done, and they're not actually listening to anything you say, and they don't want to learn anything more. They just want to repeat what they've always said. But you know what? That doesn't make you a failure. What you do is you provide the environment and you pray for the best. Stephen Brookfield says you hope for the best. I'd say you pray for the best, because you never know. People's hearts can be changed. So, he also says, Stephen Brookfield, most of this material in this lecture I'm taking from Stephen Brookfield in multiple areas. That was kind of where I cut my teeth on thinking about teaching and teaching practices. But he says that there are 4 assumptions of skillful teaching. First thing he says is, do whatever helps students learn. Good teaching is whatever helps students learn. Techniques and training can be helpful, but they can also be unhelpful because you can overly focus on the technique instead of remembering what the technique is supposed to do. Whatever teaching techniques you adopt, their ultimate purpose is to help people learn. And if it's not helping them learn, then it's not working. So if it helps students learn, do it. One of my professors in college used to hop up on the desk if he thought that we were kind of had low energy that day, or if we were bored or starting to fall asleep. He'd hop up on the desk and he'd holler and he'd yell and he'd get our attention. And if that's what works, do it. Another professor of mine would take Fridays off to meet with his students in smaller groups and get to know them better. And that actually helped aid the learning process. I've had all sorts of teachers who've done all sorts of interesting and odd things, some of which worked, some of which didn't. It doesn't matter if others think it's weird. It doesn't matter if you think it's weird. It doesn't matter what it is or how you do it. Does it help them learn? Great, do it. Everybody's different. Everybody has a different style. You also don't have to imitate what other people do. If it works for you and it helps students learn, do it. Do it, do it, do it. It's an assumption of skillful teaching. Another assumption of skillful teaching, a critically reflective stance towards your practice. All that means is, after you're done teaching, never, ever, ever be afraid to say, what could I do to make this better? What could I do to make this better? Now, I would recommend that in general you don't just toss that question out there, because some people's opinions are not worth your consideration. But in general, I would say you pick people that you trust and you might ask them, hey, what's your feedback on this? What do you think? And ask for their opinion and listen. And it can really be helpful, help you hone your craft and be a better teacher. For a church, a director of education, maybe you could offer periodic little workshops at church. Things like this, communication for serving the church, or other things. Provide books and video lectures for anybody who's willing to teach on how to become a better teacher. And if you're a teacher, read them, listen to them, do the work to become a better teacher. We are, especially in small groups and Bible classes, anything involving church, we are proclaiming the gospel. We're teaching scripture. Why would you not want to get better at teaching scripture? So don't be embarrassed. We can all do better in honing our craft on things like preaching or on teaching. So have a critically reflective stance towards your practice. Another assumption of skillful teaching is a constant awareness of how students are experiencing the learning. Do the students feel safe to share their opinions, especially if one student's opinion contradicts your own, or if one student's opinion differs with another's opinion? Is this an environment in which I can say what I actually think without any fear of consequences? I can actually put my thoughts out there. Is the method that you're using working? Are they actually getting the content? I mean, don't be afraid to ask, is this helpful? Do you like the PowerPoints? You don't like the PowerPoints. Then why are we doing this? I have to spend the time making them. Forget the PowerPoints. What would help? Just sitting around in a circle with our Bibles and talking it through that way. Great, let's do that. Oh, you like handouts that you can fill in the blanks? We can do that, no problem. Whatever works, do that. And ask them, what can I do to make this better? Now, of course, remember, some students are going to offer opinions that don't reflect the majority. Some students are going to offer those minority opinions that really aren't as important, but use your mind, be critically reflective, ask for feedback on how they're experiencing the learning. And then the fourth assumption of skillful teaching, all persons should be treated with respect and dignity in the classroom. All persons should be treated with dignity and respect in the classroom. All of them. It doesn't matter who they are, where they come from, everybody should be treated with respect. This is true of those whose faces look bland and unresponsive. They still need the respect. No one should be ignored or left out. This doesn't mean that you let an overly talkative student dominate the class, but it's just a matter of good facilitation. You welcome all people to share their perspectives. And if you do have a student who is overly dominating the class, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but practice the 3-person rule, that we won't say anything new until 3 other people have shared, and then we can speak again. And it doesn't have to be as formal as that. If they raise their hands, or if you're facilitating and just say, yeah, you, and then don't come back to that student that keeps talking again until at least 3 other people have talked. It's always a good idea. Also, never assume that students of any age are stupid or unintelligent. Assume the opposite. Assume they are very intelligent. And this goes for people who aren't as educated as you. This goes for people who haven't had the same life experiences as you. It doesn't matter if they're younger or older. Never, ever, ever assume you know more. Never, ever assume that they know less. Just go into it open. Be who you are, know what you know, and let them know what they know, and see what happens. Be consistent and fair. Never overly favor one student or another. Do you treat all students the same? Those kind of questions. So, credibility and authenticity, those are the keys to being valued as a teacher by students. Having credibility and authenticity. We've already talked a little bit about authenticity, but I want to talk more about each of those in turn. So, for credibility, there's a few common indicators of credibility. For credibility, you're looking at 3 main things: expertise, experience, and rationale. So for experience, the students expect that the teacher has a higher level of experience and time spent on the material at hand. Now, as I've said, that doesn't mean you have to be an all-encompassing expert of the subject. It does mean you have already looked through the text that we're discussing. You've already read the chapter that we're discussing in our book study for small group. You've already thought about this some. And it doesn't have to be that you've mastered it, but do you have some sense of expertise that they don't have? Have you already thought through this some? If the teacher is not willing to study this more and before the rest of the class, then they're not a teacher. So spend your time learning. Make sure you can learn as much as you can. Bring some sense of an expertise. Not that you really are the world's renowned expert in, but just that you've given it some genuine thought and preparation. Students also expect experience, that this teacher has some experience doing this. Now, this comes with time, but leaning on those who have taught successfully for longer periods of time can be very helpful. So co-teaching a class at church or co-leading a small group can really cut your teeth really quick. And also just don't be afraid to be, and this goes to authenticity, which we're about to get to, don't be afraid to just be honest and say, man, I did not handle that well. I really didn't facilitate this discussion very well. And you can either say, you can just apologize and say, I'm really sorry for that. Or you can say, would you guys give me a chance to go back over this next week in small group before we move on? Okay, let's try that. And I think most people would be really open to that, the experience aspect. And then rationale. Explain why you think the material is important. If you don't think the material is important, then why should we listen to you talk about it? Find a teacher who's passionate. And that's a teacher I'll listen to on just about any subject. The subject really doesn't matter. The difficulty level of the material doesn't really matter. But if the teacher thinks it's important and if the teacher's passionate about it, I'll listen all day, every day. And maybe explain why you did what you did in teaching this material the way you did. Why didn't you use a PowerPoint? Why are you using a PowerPoint? Why are we making this a discussion class? Why are we not making this a very heavy discussion class? Why are you doing so much lecture? Why is this class so long? Why is this class so short? Why is this class at this time? Why do we do small group only every other week? Don't be afraid. What's the rationale there? Explain it. And If you explain it, be open to other people's differing opinions and then offer a dialogue with that. So those would be common indicators of credibility. There's then 4 common indicators of authenticity as well. And they would be, number 1, keeping your words and actions congruent. Number 2, full disclosure. Number 3, demonstrating responsiveness. And number 4, disclosing personhood. So keeping your words and actions congruent. That is, don't say one thing, do another. It's important that we recycle, and then they see you throwing out everything at the church potluck. It's important that we slow down and read the text in detail, and then you brush over the text. Keep your words and your actions congruent. Pretty straightforward. Full disclosure, regularly make public the criteria, expectations, agendas, and assumptions that are guiding your class. In a church Bible class, don't be afraid to make the expectation clear that, hey, I want you to read John chapter 5 before we meet together next week. Don't be afraid to assign homework in a Bible class. And if they don't do it, they might not. Who cares? Students who are getting graded to do homework still don't do their homework. But some will. And I think many will. Many want to do good, even if it's just reading over it that morning before they come to church. At least they gave it some thought beforehand, and it would aid the discussion. So make that clear that that's what you want. Full disclosure. Are you teaching from a certain perspective? So for example, if I were teaching from the book of Revelation, I would want to make it clear that I am personally a post-millennialist, not a premillennialist or an amillennialist. I'm a post-millennialist. And so I would want to explain what that means, and then I could open the discussion. Okay, well, you're an amillennialist, you're not going to agree with what I say about this, but at any point that you feel I have misrepresented your side, or at any point that it's a point you really would like to make from your perspective, I'd love to hear that. And so you open that up, but make that full disclosure. Don't, you can be objective while still having an opinion. So yeah, I'm a post-millennialist, and I'm going to teach the book of Revelation from that perspective. Oh, you're a premillennialist. Great. What do you think about that? And so you can have your opinion and also still be objective. You know, I could be wrong. I don't know, but that's kind of where I land, okay? So, full disclosure. Also demonstrating responsiveness. If someone raises a concern or a question, answer it. Don't dismiss anybody's questions. Being genuinely responsive. Is a student raising their hand the whole time and you ignore them? If they want to talk after class or ask a question, are you there for them? Are you willing to keep the discussion going? When a problem arises in the classroom, like are some students gossiping or openly hostile to each other in the class? I mean, what can you do to be responsive to that situation? And then finally, disclosing personhood. In the same way that whenever you step up in the pulpit to preach, you shouldn't have a preacher persona. Whenever you step up to teach and whenever you do small group or whatever, you shouldn't have the teacher persona or the small group leader persona. You should just be who you are. And again, don't be afraid to admit you don't know. So those are just some ways to get started with teaching. But now I want to talk about the 2 main things you'll probably do in teaching in small groups, and that is lectures and discussions. Lectures and discussions. So first off, you might ask, why even give a lecture? Lectures are dry and boring. Why would you want to lecture? I actually am someone who is very much in favor of a good lecture at times. To say lecture, it doesn't mean the whole class has to be lecture, but can you make a part of it lecture? And I think there's something to be said for that. So before I get into the characteristics of what makes a really good lecture, let me talk about why you should do a lecture. I think it's good to do a lecture because it can establish the broad outline of the material you're covering, give them a bird's eye view. You can explain with frequent examples, concepts, and the learners can pick it up a little easier that way. You can introduce alternative perspectives and interpretations easier rather than leaving it completely open. And sometimes by naming, well, that view is kind of in this category and that view is kind of in this category and these are kind of opposed. Giving it names sometimes helps, and so then the student can say, oh, I think I'm in that category. I just hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that's helpful. To model intellectual attitudes and behaviors that you want to encourage the students to have as well. And you can encourage the learners' interest in a topic. I mean, passionate lecturers who really believe in what they're talking about and can talk endlessly about the subject that they're lecturing on. Those lectures are so engaging. We still find things like the great courses at the library that you can check out and listen to, because people love to listen to people teach when they're passionate about the subject. Again, we've already said that. So let's talk about the characteristics of a helpful lecture. I hope you're convinced that you should do some lecture sometimes, but let's assume that you're already convinced you should do some lecture. Let's talk about some characteristics that make a lecture helpful. You want to be dynamic and varied. Use a variety of teaching communication processes. Don't be afraid of silence. For example, if you ask a question, don't be afraid to pause and just wait. And wait until the student answers, and wait till they answer, and actually leave that space open, because it shows you actually want someone to respond. You can say you could pause in the middle of the lecture and say, okay, this is a lot of material. Everybody take a breath. Okay. Is there any part of this that isn't making sense? And so that's something you could do is pause and ask students what they're thinking. One practice is to what's called lecture from Siberia. That is, you move to a place in the room that is far away from the front where you usually teach, and to continue teaching from there. Even just doing that, so if you start in the front and then at some point you move to the back, sometimes that helps students learn. Sometimes they like that, especially during a lecture. Don't be afraid to poll the audience and say, show of hands, who thinks? Or use a whiteboard to tally the answers, or some sort of software like polleverywhere.com. It's a great little website you can use where people can text in their answers. Don't be afraid to chunk your lectures into smaller units. And also consider doing a meta class. I call it a meta class. That is, weave lecture, discussion, videos, music, poetry, props, illustrations. Just get creative. Weave it all together. Make a full presentation of it. I have a youth minister friend who does this with his youth classes every week. He will blend and weave together different elements around a common theme or a passage of scripture as kind of like an extended meditation on it. So he'll have periods of teaching and lecture. He'll have periods of discussion, periods of poetry, periods of worship, periods of craft, periods of silent reflection, and his students eat it up. They love it. They love that extended meditation on whatever it is, and it's a varied practice. So there's not just lecture all the way through. So don't be afraid to think of lecture as more than what we have typically thought of as lecture. Also, be sure to clearly and cleverly organize your lectures. The more clearly organized your material, the easier it is for people to understand. If you're not clear on the organization of the material you're presenting, neither will anybody else be. So be as clear as you possibly can. Be sure to be clear in your own preparation, and whether you have notes or a PowerPoint, be sure it's clear and easy to follow. Provide maybe some outline notes, just like a rough outline of where we're going, just something people can have to kind of help them follow. You can provide fill in the blank notes, kind of like we're doing for this, that will help people follow along, just something to help. And then also model learning behaviors. Are you modeling the learning? A good lecture models the learning. Begin lectures with a question or a small set of questions that you're trying to answer, or end every lecture with a series of questions that your lecture has raised or left unanswered. Or say, well, this lecture addressed this, but I really didn't go into, and tell them what it didn't address. And then maybe that's an interest area that they can go. Don't be afraid to go assumption hunting. Pause in the lecture and ask students to identify what the assumption behind the statement is. So make a statement and then say, what's the assumption there? And then let them respond and see what they say. So now let's talk about a good discussion. So we talked about lectures, now let's talk about good discussion, because this is even more characteristic. Most people, when they come to church and they come to a Bible class or they go to a small group, they're going to talk, they want to discuss, their voice is welcomed there. And it may be one of the few spaces in their world where their voice is truly welcomed. But what's really important is not that you just say, well, we're going to have a discussion, but that you learn the art of facilitating good discussion. Asking open-ended questions and helping move the discussion along, and how you do that. So a couple things. I think it's a good idea to have some ground rules for discussion. So don't be afraid to create some ground rules. These can be explicit. You hand them out on a piece of paper and say, hey, here's the ground rules. You can have them just personally in your own head, and these are the rules that I'm going to try to follow as a facilitator. One of the best ways to come up with those rules is just to think about some of the best discussion groups you've ever been in and some of the worst discussion groups you've ever been in. Make some notes about those, and then ask yourself, what can I do to make the good things happen and the bad things not happen? Pretty simple. And take that list with you as you facilitate, and then think about it before and after you've already started. When it comes to getting a discussion started, there's two great pieces of advice I'd give you. The first is sentence completion. Students complete a sentence made by the teacher by writing it or typing it, and then they discuss it verbally. So for example, if I put up on a PowerPoint and I say, the power of the gospel is... All right, what do you guys think? Take a moment to think about it. And then now let's talk about it. Talk to your neighbor, get into groups of 2 or 3 and talk about it for a moment, and then we'll come all together. See, that works really well. Sentence completion is a great thing. So just leave it open-ended. That's a good way to leave it open-ended. Or just make a really definitive, provocative opening statement. Don't be afraid to take a hard stance to start a discussion. It doesn't mean you have to actually think it, but consider it like playing devil's advocate. So, for example, even if you don't think that that's the case, you could start a discussion of predestination versus free will, a discussion sometimes we have in church. And you could say, if God knows all things, then all things are predestined. Discuss. And play devil's advocate. And then, I mean, that statement right there. I know some of you are like wanting to tell me why you think that's true, or you're like, oh no, that's not the case. And you're ready to discuss it. A good, well-crafted, provocative statement can really get the discussion started. So give them a moment to think about it and then respond. Great way to get that going. Finally, I have a few ideas for discussion. And if you do the readings that are recommended or that I have provided for the original class, then you'll already know a little bit about these. I would highly recommend to you this book, the discussion book, 50 Great Ways to Get People Talking by Stephen Brookfield and Stephen Preskill. Each method in this book, it's 50 different discussion ideas, how to get people talking. And it goes through things that would help in a corporate way, help in an academic way. And for each one, it talks about what the practice is, what the purpose of it is, descriptions of where and when it would work well, potential problems with it. And so these 4 that I'm going to recommend to you right now are a few of my favorites that I think would work particularly well in church settings. So don't freak out at the name of this one, but the first one is cocktail party. The idea is that the teacher prepares non-alcoholic drinks, I would imagine, and snacks along with index cards with discussion prompts on them. And people are encouraged to mingle amongst themselves to eat and drink and discuss. And they're encouraged to start a new discussion every 5 minutes. So you can set a timer, and every 5 minutes the timer goes off, and that's your cue to wrap up your conversation and move on to another. And a way I think this might also work well is if you could find a way to like glue or tape the index cards that have the discussion prompts onto little drink cups or onto the snack bowls or onto the plate that they have to carry with them to get snacks. And that way, every time that they, for example, take a food from the tray, it comes in a little miniature plate that has their discussion prompt on it. And then after they eat it, they throw it away and keep going. It has a playfulness and an informality to it. And I could see this really working well for a Bible class at church. I think kids might even enjoy this depending on the age range. You have snacks set up with these discussion prompts. And then at the end, you come all together and you talk about what you learned and what you enjoyed about it, etc. Another one is called Hat Full of Quotes. The teacher prepares a hat full of typed quotes for a Bible class, and this would be verses that seem to support or contradict the text at hand. And it could be a commentator's statement about the text. It could be a contentious assertion about the text or observations about various aspects of the text. And so you just print up all these little quotes and put them in a bowl or a hat, toss it around, pull one out. All right, what's your response to that? So that could be fun. And so especially like, let's go back to the predestination or free will. You could have verses that seem to support one or the other. And if it's just that and they don't have all the other ones in front of them, they pull it out and they say, well, and so then that prompts discussion. And so you let each student pull one out and respond to it as they see fit, and then others can respond to their response. So be sure that each person responds to their paper and not other people's paper until after they responded to their own. And have people jot down, give them a piece of paper to scratch on and just jot down their thoughts, and then we can come all together at the end and discuss it. Many people appreciate having time to think about what their slip of paper says. So you might hand it out ahead of time and just say, everybody pick one out, and then we'll go around the room and discuss them. Another one that I think would work particularly well for a Bible class is called titling the text. So you remove, maybe in a Bible class, you would remove all the verse numbers, headings, and footnotes from the biblical text. And then you pass it out, this printout with this plain text, and you ask people to structure and give headings to it. So Bibles, naturally, translations have headings. You can remove them if you go to BibleGateway.com and follow the example that I gave in a previous video. And you can remove all that information and then let people come up with their own headings. How would you head it if you were a Bible translator? Oh, that'd be a great discussion. How would you head this section or these various sections? How would you split the text up if you were a Bible translator and you had to organize it into paragraphs? Oh, that could be really fun. As I can imagine that in a youth group or with kids, you could find a way to send it to them like on an iPad or something. You could have a couple of computers or iPads set up around the room where they can actually move the text around and organize it in the way that makes sense to them and then explain why. And then finally, consider using the 3-person rule. I've already briefly alluded to this, but the 3-person rule is just that people can't speak again until after 3 other people have responded. It's usually helpful for larger groups. If your group is already pretty small, this probably isn't going to work. But in general, and this could be a formal or an informal rule, a rule that you keep in the back of your mind, or a rule that you actually say, hey, this is the practice and this is what we're doing, and let them in on it. So those are just some key tips for teaching and doing small groups, facilitation. Again, some of this might relate to academia, some of this might not. So if you've been involved in teaching in formal academic settings, some of this you might say that's good, and some of this you might say that wouldn't work in a school setting, and that's okay. I tried to appropriate some of this material for teaching in church and doing small groups. So I hope you found it helpful, and I look forward to discussing it. Be blessed.